Let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear God in heaven, we are thankful for this Sabbath day that you have blessed us with. Another day where we can come together and study, we can relax, we can recharge, we can learn more about the issues that are relevant for us and for the dispensation that we are living in. Lord, we want to learn more, we want to understand these important topics more about feminism, about radical feminism, atheism, and to better be able to see the threat to feminism in this world today, and see this group, understand this group better, and to help us eventually understand the Sunday law better, so that we may end up being on the right side of the issues and pass the test. I pray that you will bless this presentation. Please be with me as I present. Help me to present clearly and in an understandable fashion. Please also be with the listeners so they might be blessed and glean something from this presentation. Maybe it's something that's going to be refreshed. Maybe it's something we've already heard before, but we know that repetition deepens impressions, so help us to repeat and go over these things. Be with us, and I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Today we're going to talk about gender and try to trace the connection, or gender is a very broad topic, but look at gender from Darwin to Dawkins, and that is also the title of this presentation. It was originally done on the 29th of April 2022, so almost 2 years ago, but it's still very relevant to us today, as we shall see. So in the past few weeks, of course, there was this camp meeting last Sabbath and also another one before that, but otherwise we've been discussing modern atheism, and we've talked a lot about the Trinity, which is composed of three things: men's rights activism, libertarianism, and atheism. And today we're going to focus a lot on atheism. We have talked about the leadership underneath or the leadership in new atheism or modern atheism, and the four horsemen connected to that. And these four horsemen are Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, 𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗃 Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. And we've talked about them before in previous presentations, and we've kind of traced them all the way from the leadership, if we can call these four horsemen the leadership, all the way to Max, as being maybe the layman, the regular member. So there's a big problem of pervasive sexism and misogyny in atheism today. And in general, we know and understand that the left wing stand for equality above freedom, or where equality governs freedom, and the right wing, they support freedom above equality. So left equality governs freedom, and right freedom governs equality. And I think amongst us in the movement, and I think in general, when we learn about these things, there's a general surprise that the atheistic community is actually just as bad, and actually maybe perhaps even worse than the far-right religious ideologies when it comes to sexism, misogyny. At least I remember being very surprised, not very surprised, but surprised to actually see the problem, because I didn't understand atheism the way that we do today. So it's very important for us, as this last point on the recap, so to speak, about what we've talked about and discussed in recent studies. It's very important for us to understand that Protestantism is not either the cause of the problem in the world today, and we define the problem as being the nature of the Sunday law, which we know is going to be about gender discrimination, inequality. So Protestantism is not either the cause of this problem in the world today, and Protestantism is also not the whole either. There is more to it. And before given our Adventist background, we've been very much focused on Protestantism, the false prophet in Bible prophecy. But that's why it's so important to actually dive deeper and see that there's more to it. It's not, Protestantism is not the main problem. That's really important to understand. So there are a lot of very influential and highly misogynistic / sexist scientists and leaders underneath these four horsemen, and they are just as misogynistic as these four horsemen are. So it's not just limited to them when speaking about atheism. There are men held in very high esteem in the atheistic community, and we know that, and have come to know, that sexual abuse and misogyny is very built in the scientific community. And one of those that we're going to take a look at today, one of these men underneath the four horsemen who are held in high esteem, is a person called Lawrence Krauss. He's an American theorist, physicist, and a cosmologist. And I just quickly want to show an image of him just so you have an idea of who he is. Let me see here. There's someone. Maybe I cannot actually share my screen, but you can try to Google him. I know most of you have your laptops or devices ready. I don't have the settings enabled, then I would have to restart the meeting. So his name is Lawrence Krauss, and you can just Google him so you have an idea of like who he is, how he looks like. He is a very misogynistic leader in this scientific atheistic community. Jeffrey Epstein was a very good friend of his, and Lawrence Krauss defended him vigorously. There's an article from Atlantic that I want to read from, where it says, sexual misconduct cases do not fit neatly into the framework that governs rigorous scientific inquiry. If there is one thing that we have learned from the Me Too movement, it's that so much of understanding injustice is experiential and rooted in anecdotal evidence. For hardcore freethinkers, that's a problem, because personal testimonies can't be verified in an empirical way, which was part of Lawrence Krauss' justification for Jeffrey Epstein, that the evidence and the testimonies, they couldn't be verified in any empirical way through studies or observations. Actually, Naftali wrote in the outline after the allegation of Krauss was made public. There were some allegations of him that he was he had some misconduct. That's not the right word, but sexual misconduct. He had groped some women and sorry. It's not misbehavior. He was being, I forgot the word, but sexual misconduct is the best word I can put to it. But there were some allegations of him having done certain things against certain women. And this Ashley Naftali, she wrote after these allegations of Krauss, they were made public: if something cannot be measured, calculated, observed, watched, it may as well not exist, even though studies of sexual harassment in the scientific community reveal the opposite to be true. So this is part of, sorry, you wanted to say something? Det er ikke en del af min præsentation. Sorry about that. So I want to rephrase the last part again. If something cannot be measured, calculated, observed, watched, it may as well not exist, even though studies of sexual harassment in the scientific community reveal the opposite to be true. So this is part of the problem that men's rights activists have with feminism, and in general with issues of equality, in that so much of these experiences, and if we remember the Me Too movement, a lot of these experiences, they are rooted in experience and in anecdotal evidence. It's not as though people, they have scientific measurements of abuse happening. It's based in experience and anecdotal evidence. And these people like Lawrence Krauss, they see that as very similar to religious thought. And this is where, for them, religion and feminism are intertwined and kind of the same thing. So it's, it cannot be measured. It's based on experience and anecdotes. It's not really that can be calculated, measured, like in proper scientific settings. So for them, religion and feminism, they kind of merge in this intersection, and becomes kind of the same thing. And you cannot go into some aspects of inequality and some aspects of the Me Too movement allegations with that type of scientific inquiring brain and find all the shreds of evidence to build a case, because it just doesn't exist. There often isn't much left at the end of rape or some other sexual misconduct case. It's, as I said, it's not something that's bound upon hardcore measurements or calculations, observations. It's based on on women's experience, and it becomes anecdotal evidence, which in general is seen as weak evidence in the scientific community. So we shouldn't just be able to see us in the movement and spot the sexism and racism. We will talk about racism a little bit later on, but we shouldn't just be able to spot the sexism and the racism in these men, but we should also understand how they justify their sexism, because that is really what is going to educate us, their way of thinking when we understand that, and not just the acts when we see them. We should understand both, but it's important to understand the mechanism behind their justifications of their sexism. So these men, whether that's the Four Horsemen or the many leaders and influential people underneath them, they see these allegations and they see that the issues that feminists and women are trying to raise, like almost a religion, in that these men, atheists, scientific atheists, if I can call them that, with their brain governed by rigorous scientific inquiry, they cannot get to the root of. And when they already have a foundational misogyny, this only exacerbates that kind of excuse. So again, we need to not just know that these men are sexist and misogynistic, but we should also understand their type of thinking and the methodology that they use in their thinking to understand what underlies their misogyny. So we'll go a little bit back to Richard Dawkins. We've talked about him before. We'll talk a little bit about him again. He's one of the more obvious misogynistic, transphobic, racist, new atheist leaders, and we will just briefly touch on his views on trans people, for instance. So Richard Dawkins, he compared the lives of trans people to 𝗂𝗽𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, and I don't know if you remember her or know who she is, but she was a white woman who in 2015 basically said that she identified now as a Black woman, and she then tried to forge a career in Black activism and academia. I'm going to read a quote from Richard Dawkins from his Twitter. Some men choose to identify as women, and some women choose to identify as men. You will be vilified if you deny that they literally are what they identify as. Discuss. So he ends his tweet with the word discuss. So he will tweet that and at the end say discuss, and then he gets attacked, obviously, because it's a highly controversial statement today. He then says that he was just basically trying to engage in this scientific reasoning in open discussion. He wasn't necessarily giving his own thoughts. He was just stating something and then telling people to discuss it on Twitter. Kind of innocent, but we should know that it's basically a cover for his own views. And then he said, in another setting, is a trans woman a woman? Purely semantic. If you define by chromosomes, no. If by self-identification, yes. I call her she out of courtesy. I don't like the idea that some people can pillory someone like Jordan Peterson for refusing to be compelled to change his language. Those that do so are denying reality, and it's heresy to do anything other than that. So the two things that we want to take out of this. The first thing is his defense of Jordan Peterson should not surprise us. These men, they are religiously or atheistically, ideologically aligned when it comes to gender. And with that, you find this friendship between atheism and the far right, in that they agree on gender. It's a common foundation. And number two, he suggests that you become a heretic for questioning something like trans identity. And if Richard Dawkins is a heretic to questioning something related to gender, what does that make the gender issue? It makes it a kind of a type of religion, because heresy is a religious term. Heresy is war against or opposition to religion. So he kind of makes his own position a religious position by invoking a word such as heresy. So they invoke that religious type of language when referencing not just feminism, but in general gender-related issues like trans identity, for instance. So that's important to note. There, or Richard Dawkins, how he's kind of tying it together with religion, that their viewpoint is kind of religious. We want to discuss Daniel Dennett now. We would think that he's maybe the least problematic of the four horsemen, and in many ways, apparently he is. I haven't personally dug very deep down into Daniel Dennett, so for me, he's relatively unknown. He seems to be less on a warpath and much more careful in how he phrases his beliefs, but he is very close with Richard Dawkins, so it's not a false assumption to think that they share a lot of the same values and ideas. And now maybe I will have to try to screen share, because I want to show a debate between him and Dinesh D'Souza. It's about the existence of God, because Dinesh D'Souza, he believes in the existence of God. But there's a woman asking a particular question, and I want to show you the question and Daniel Dennett's response. I'll see if I can screen share.
Don't forget to, there's somewhere a checkbox where you also need to checkbox the audio so that we can hear it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just did that, but
okay.
Yeah, I'll see if I can screen share, because apparently I didn't have the settings enabled. Oh, I think I can. Great. Can you see my screen? Great. I saw Wouter giving a thumbs up. So let's test if you can hear the audio as well. We hear.
That's our last two.
Did you hear the audio? Okay, great. So there's a woman asking a question, and then I will forward to Daniel Dennett's response. So I'll make full screen.
So my question is
a minute, and then we're done.
So my question is, first of all, I don't really believe that there has been equal dignity for women established universally. I think it's more legislative than actually socially or culturally established. But this is for both candidates, as has been said. But why are women almost universally excluded from the hierarchies of religion and decision making in religions?
Thank you. Ask the next question, please.
And I will forward to the response.
I'll answer the first one. I think the reason that women have in general not played those roles does have ultimately a biological explanation in terms of the way in which human cultures have evolved and in the way in which males have moved into positions of power and maintained them over the years. That's a lot.
I just want us to hear his reply again. Actually, let's listen to the woman also.
So my question is, first of all, I don't really believe that there has been equal dignity for women established universally. I think it's more legislative than actually socially or culturally established. But this is for both candidates, as has been said. But why are women almost universally excluded from the hierarchies of religion and decision making in religions?
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll answer the first one. I think the reason that women have in general not played those roles does have ultimately a biological explanation in terms of the way in which human cultures have evolved and in the way in which males have moved into positions of power and maintained them over the years. That's a long story, but it's also, I think, not very original. So I think it's a good question, and I think it has an answer if you consider religion as a natural phenomenon, as I do, and there's quite a literature on it. Now,
and then he goes into a longer explanation of what he thinks about it, but we got his main point in this clip. So Daniel Dennett's primary reason for why women haven't attained to the same positions, in, let's say, executive positions in religion, is biological. And a lot of feminists did not appreciate his answer. He hints that there are multiple reasons, but the primary one, which he mentions first, is biological. And I just want us to consider if that same explanation, biological, was given as to why all but one of all the United States presidents has been white. I mean, that would have been outrageous. But he gives this explanation when it comes to gender. So this idea of the biological is another way of saying intrinsic strength and intrinsic weaknesses, which is basically social Darwinism. You know, that males, they are strong in this and this and this area, weak in this one and these ones, and the same goes for women. So when Daniel Dennett, he has the very opportunity in front of the most racist, misogynistic, conspiratorial, right-wing defender, which is this D'Souza personality. He has this opportunity to take religious institutions to task with their misogyny and level some kind of critique. He basically justifies the sexism in religion as having a biological foundation. And again, it's the first tenet of social Darwinism, this belief that people have intrinsic abilities and talents, and correspondingly, they also have intrinsic weaknesses. I want to read from an article titled "Brazen Sexism is Pushing Women Out of America's Atheism Movement." As a capitalist-fueled institution, new atheism has established itself as a mirror image of religion. So you have religion and you have new atheism, and it's a mirror. As a mirror image of religion, with Dawkins and friends situating themselves at the pinnacle of the movement in the role of God feminist, in the role of God feminist philosopher. No, in the role of God. Feminist philosopher Elizabeth Gross put it this way: God is dead, long live man. So Dawkins and the male leaders of the movement, they have resurrected man as God. For these men, misogyny is not based in religion, but in biology. And that is what Daniel Dennett, the one man who had eluded us in our discussions presentation so far, he was saying misogyny is not based in religion for them. It's based in biology. And that is why you find misogyny within atheism, because atheism focuses on, you know, evolution, how biology has evolved and changed through millions and gazillions of years. But misogyny is based in biology, because biology is building on, at least in atheism, this social or Darwinism, social Darwinism, because we're not animals, so it's social Darwinism, you know. So I hope you see the connection there. And if religion was the cause of misogyny, then getting rid of religion would solve misogyny for atheists. But because it is not, its cause is not religion, but biology. When the atheists, are not able to divorce themselves from sexism, from gender stereotypes, whether that relates to women or LGBT, so that because the cause is not religion but biology, then the atheists are not able to divorce themselves from sexism, from gender stereotypes, and so on. And that's why we see a lot of gender stereotypes, a lot of sexism in the new atheist movement, if we can call it that, or the atheist movement. I'm not sure I should call it new atheism. And again, it's this return to rational thought again, being able to pull something apart and really understand it. And how do you do that with the subjects such as trans people? Because again, there's so much of that experience that is experiential, so much that we don't understand so far. She mentions an example of her friend going to a gastroenterologist, and this gastroenterologist said that, you know, we only understand like let's say 1% of how the gastric system works. So 1%, and then she says, then what about the brain? If like that's an organ that we consider to be even more complex, and you know that's tied to, let's say, gender issues and so on. So like we don't understand anything. A lot of it is experiential, and rational thought just cannot be introduced into this discussion because we don't understand it. So what we should see is that it's easy to see and prove that these sexist, these men we've looked at, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett now, two of the horsemen, it's easy to see and prove that they're sexist, but we want to understand why they are and where it really comes from. And we've already seen now that it doesn't come from religion, because they're just as sexist and misogynist, if not more, than religious people are. And they attributed it to their justification, and it's biology, inherent strength and weaknesses. So now let's go a little back and look at Darwin, Charles Darwin, and his thinking. First off, I'm gonna read some quotes from Charles Darwin on race, and afterwards on gender. First quote on race is a short one. The differences of this kind between the highest men of the highest races and the lowest savages are connected by the finest graduations. So Darwin is saying that there is a smooth transition or gradual change in abilities and characteristics between the most successful, he calls it races, but it's people, in advanced societies and the least advanced people in primitive societies. It's like there's this continuous line connecting them. You could also say a spectrum without any sudden jumps. So these races, they're connected in this spectrum. And Charles Darwin, he was arguing that basically some races are more evolved than others. They're not all separate and distinct. So there are men, he calls it races, who are the highest men, as he said in the quote, and then men or races who are the lowest savages. But it's all talking about humans. And I think Charles Darwin, he lived he was born 1809 and died 1882. So let's just say similar time as Ellen White. And this was his thoughts at the time. Quote number 2 on race. He says, at some future period, not very distant, as measured by centuries, meaning soon, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout all the world the savage races. And this was a good thing for Darwin. So the better races would replace and exterminate the savage races as he saw them. So what he was talking about was having a bigger gap between the animal kingdom and the human race. So eliminating those steps that take you through the spectrum of more evolved and less evolved. So he kind of did a compare and contrast that in the future, we would potentially end up with Caucasian people. He didn't say this in the quote, but that was what he believed. And then the next step down with a big gap would be down to some ape as low as a baboon, that would be more ideal for him than to have all of like the superior human race, then a lesser human race on the spectrum, but rather this singular supreme Caucasian race, and then down to some ape below that. That would be the ideal world for him. So that was Charles Darwin on race. Now I want to jump to Charles Darwin on gender. And now that I can share my screen, I'll try to do so you can read along. Share screen. So reading, because the half-human male progenitors of man have struggled together during many generations for the possession of the females, to avoid enemies or to attack them with success. To capture wild animals and to invent and fashion weapons requires the aid of the higher mental faculties, namely observation, reason, invention, or imagination. These various faculties will thus have been continually put to the test and selected during manhood. So, because of their role and but to possess the females and reproduce and evolve, they, the males, had to have the higher mental faculties. So consequently, in accordance with the principles often alluded to, we might expect that they would at least tend to be transmitted chiefly to the male offspring at the corresponding period of manhood. And I'm going to jump to the second quote. Number 2, from Charles Darwin. The chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than women can attain, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of the senses and hands. If 2 lists were made of the most eminent men and women in poetry, painting, sculpture, music, history, science, and philosophy, with half a dozen names under each subject, the 2 lists would not bear comparison. We might also infer from the law of the deviation of averages that if men are capable of decided eminence over women in many subjects, the average standard of mental power in man must be above that of a woman, and thus man has ultimately become superior to woman. So Darwin, he basically says that, well, let's do 2 lists and list all the best painters, people who do poetry, sculpture, music, history, science, and philosophy, and write a dozen names under each one. And he says they would not even be comparable. The list for men and women, like the men would just be so much better and exceed, the women. And then he also uses this law of the deviation of averages, which is basically to say that, if you look at let's say the average level of men in music and the average level of women in music, you will see that men, they are above women. So he comes to the logical conclusion for him that means that men, they're just always better. But returning to the race question again, Darwin, we read some quotes from Darwin. It's clear to see that he believed in a better race and a worse race, and we have heard those arguments before in more modern times. But it was really Darwin's half cousin, Francis Galton, who thought that we should give this racial differentiation process kind of a helping hand. Because Francis Galton, he decided that natural selection doesn't really work well in human societies the way it does in nature, because people, they have a tendency to interfere with the process. So what ends up happening in amongst humans is the fittest does not always survive as we see in nature. Sometimes it's the weakest amongst humans, and that's not ideal. So he coined the term eugenics, and eugenics stem from the Greek word that means good birth or noble in heredity. So quote from, I've written that it's a quote from Francis Galton, but maybe it's an autobiography of him. Reading, in 1883, Galton defined eugenics as the science of improving stock, which is by no means confined to questions of judicious mating, but which takes cognizance of all influences that tends to, however remote a degree, give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable races or strains of blood than they otherwise would have. So eugenics is basically helping these better or more suitable races to prevail speedily over the less ideal races. He basically says that eugenics is about speeding up this process of natural selection amongst humans so that the more suitable races become more dominant more quickly. And he, in his time, he referred to this as something that must be introduced to the nation, to the national conscience, like a new religion, because they really saw it as a problem that natural selection couldn't really have its way amongst humans. So Francis Galton, he sees this new form of atheism as a form of religion, atheism being, biology rules, natural selection above everything else. He sees this new form of atheism as a form of religion to get people to embrace and follow it. That's why he said, or that he wanted to introduce it to the nation on a national conscience level, like a new religion. Another quote from Francis Galton, he says, "It has indeed strong claims to become an orthodox religious tenet of the future," talking about eugenics. For eugenics cooperates with the workings of nature, evolution, by ensuring that humanity shall be represented by the fittest races. Amongst some of the things that Francis Galton, he was a proponent of, he wanted to colonize Africa actually with Chinese people, because he believed that the Chinese people were a more suitable race than the African race or people. And you can read more about it if you Google Francis Galton and the colonization of Africa. And I haven't done so myself, but supposedly it's quite tough reading. I assume that he was quite direct in his ideas or thoughts about it. But I want us to see that eugenics has a direct link through to not just social Darwinism, which is this concept of the survival of the fittest among humans and inherent strengths and weaknesses, but eugenics also have a direct link to Charles Darwin himself and his very family. But where social Darwinism really took its most shape was in the interaction between Charles Darwin and his advocates. And there were three men. They were called, their names were August Schleicher, Max Müller, and Ernst Haigler Haeckel. So I think we all can hear where these names stem from geographically. Germany, German names, German men. So he found his greatest advocates for social Darwinism in Germany. And in the interaction between these men was where social Darwinism actually really developed. So these men, they all reasoned that the human brain and the ape brain were about the same size. So Darwin and his colleagues suspected that because they were the same size, the ape brain and the human brain, or perhaps the orangutan brain and the human brain, that only the invention of language could really account for the differentiation between humans and other great apes. Like that was the only thing that they could see as being a factor of differentiation. So they recognized that because of the evolution of language and the mind go hand in hand. From this perspective, empirical evidence from languages from around the world, observations, studies, was interpreted by Haeckel in Germany as supporting the idea that nations, despite having rather similar physiologies, actually represented distinct lines of evolution. So even though, let's say, me, as someone from Lithuania, my body is totally the same as someone from Japan, because our languages have evolved differently. That must mean that we have distinct lines of evolution. So because we have different languages, they suggested that these different languages showed that different races evolved kind of separately, and became separate races. And despite this similar physiology, these races, they were distinct lines of evolution that they could separate from one another. And then what these men did was that they divided mankind into 9 different species. So imagine, like, if I drew a circle that said mankind and then had 9 lines going out from the circle, we would have these 9 different species. But the problem is that quickly they started not just ranking them in terms of different species, but also they started to rank them in terms of intellectual hierarchies. And when you do that, some races will inevitably come up on top, and some of the other races will be at the bottom. Some will be better, some will be worse, some will be supreme. Reading from the Wikipedia section, you can find it. It's called Social Darwinism. Further interpretations moved to ideologies propagating a racist and hierarchical society, and provided ground for the latter radical versions of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism came to play a major role in the ideology of Nazism, which combined it with a similar pseudoscientific theory of racial hierarchy to identify the Germans as part of what the Nazis regarded as an Aryan or a Nordic master race. So it's all this thinking, dividing up races and then stratifying them, that came from social Darwinism. Biology, atheism, all of this. It's important that when we say social Darwinism, think biology, think evolution, think atheism, because that is what atheism believes in. Reading on in this Wikipedia article, Nazism's social Darwinist beliefs led them to retain business, competition, and private property as economic engines. Nazism likewise opposed social welfare based on a social Darwinist belief that the weak and feeble should perish for the sake of the nation. So, if you're unemployed because you broke your back or something, that's just social Darwinism in Nazi Germany would say, well, that's too bad. You shouldn't get any help because this is just evolution taking its course and doing what it's supposed to do. So this association with Nazism coupled, or the social Darwinist association with Nazism, coupled with increasing recognition that it was actually scientifically unfounded, contributed to the broader rejection of social Darwinism after the end of World War II. So if the 4 horsemen that we've talked about are going to claim that religion is the cause of war, which they do, and suffering in society and nations, then really they should have a very close look at the Holocaust and its origins, because the Holocaust became a reality due to social Darwinism, which is to say inherent weaknesses and strengths, amongst people, which is to trace it to biology, which is to trace it to all the way back to, atheist origins. That's something to keep in mind. And that's something that for some reason they don't see this connection. Or maybe they don't want to see this connection. So the problem is that people today now argue the following. They say that social Darwinism is actually not scientific, because atheism is supposed to look only at biology, only at how biology has developed over millions of years. And they, the atheists, they say social Darwinism is pseudoscience because it isn't based in biology. But gender is based in biology. So you cannot really separate social Darwinism with the study of biology when it becomes connected together. And that's really important to see. or in simpler terms, you could argue that, you know, the critics, they argue that it's not scientific because social Darwinism doesn't adhere to the principles of biology. However, since gender is rooted in biology, the study of social Darwinism as it pertains to gender cannot really be divorced from biology. So even though it's still yeah, I'm gonna skip this part. I want to screen share an article from The Guardian that's displaying this kind of thinking at work, even in recent times. It's an article from 2010. Let me share my screen. An article from 2010 titled "Why Do Nice Girls Fall for Bad Boys?" It's a very short article. 𝘃𝗶𝗱𝗲𝗏 or James shines the cold light of evolutionary psychology on readers' problems. So she is an evolutionary psychologist, and she has this column, maybe, or had this column in the Guardian where people could write questions to her, and she would answer it based on her evolutionary psychologist thinking. So the question is, irresistible rascals, from a nice girl aged 37. Dear Carol, why do girls, even nice girls, fall for bad boys, even when the girls in question are 37 and should know much better? My friends and I don't understand ourselves. So that is the question. Why do nice girls fall for bad boys? And she replies, the dark triad of human behavior consists of narcissism or self-obsession, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. Bad boys exhibit dark triad traits, and their behavior, according to one theory, is genetic, meaning they are unlikely to change their ways. Again, inherent strengths. It's something that's in them. They cannot help themselves. Boys will be boys, this kind of thinking. That is what this evolutionary psychologist is saying. These types of males tend to favor short-term relationships, including one-night stands, over long-term relationships. They also tend to compete with other males by poaching mates for brief affairs. Research has shown that a touch of evil can bring fitness benefits. These males tend to have more female partners and thus more reproductive opportunities than other males. The fictional character of James Bond is frequently cited as possessing dark triad traits. Although the dark triad personality type appears to be universal in human society, having been identified in 57 countries, it does exact real costs. Otherwise, bad boys would be more common. Those exhibiting dark triad behavior need to prey on the cooperative and unsuspecting. Evolutionary anthropological research on hunter-gatherers such as the Kungsan of the Kalahari has shown that successful risk-taking hunters who bring home the bacon, quote unquote, for the group get the most mating opportunities. So very biological evolutionary language is being used, which is no surprise because she's an evolutionary psychologist. As a single trait, successful risk-taking is universally appreciated as a sign of good genes. The combination of brave, risk-taking behavior is frequently attractive to females in the short term, but in the long term, although females remain attracted to bravery and risk-taking, they also look for the crucial additional trait of altruism. Ironically, nice girls may be the only females who tolerate the dark triad male personality, forgiving these naughty boys and inadvertently giving them yet another chance to misbehave. Are you prepared to be a single mother? a bad boy son who survives all the risk-taking behavior to reach reproductive age may make you a granny many times over, but are you really looking for quantity over quality? You need to ask yourself this: do I want to be another notch on this man's bedpost, or would it be wiser to hold out for a brave altruist? So main point is boys will be boys according to her. You know, it's genetic, not anything you can do anything about. This is the way that evolution has forged men, that they, you know, become bad boys, but also that evolution has created or forced females to be attracted to these kind of males or men. So this article is proof that social Darwinism is alive and well today. You know, it hasn't ended with Darwin or Francis Galton. And basically, the article justifies abuse through the concept of genetics and biology. As I said, these men were created by natural selection, according to her or to them, and they are in many cases unable to change. They are product of evolution, which we just need to live with. You know, the boys, they cannot help it. They're not in control. Therefore, you cannot hold them accountable as social evolution created them in this way. This is the evolutionary way of looking at it, the atheistic, biological way. So they still believe in biology. It's evident, which brings us to that root problem. Why is there misogyny and sexism within the atheistic community? Why do you find this atheism part of the right-wing trinity, where they are also often part of the men's rights movement? If you believe that these differences are biological, that it's not a man's fault the way he acts, sexual abuses and so on, that it's often a woman's problem, that she's simply attracted to men in this way, so that she bears responsibility when she gets into an abusive relationship and is mistreated. If you believe all that, and then you say feminists are trying to take down masculinity, which, you know, the men's rights activists they are, then it's quite an easy slide into men's rights movements. So building upon the biological belief that it's not a man's fault, that's simply the way that he is created. He cannot do anything about it. More often than not, it's a woman's problem. It's her problem that she's attracted to men. It's her responsibility when she gets in an abusive relationship and so on. And then if somebody comes and says, hey, look at this group, they're trying to take down our masculinity, then it's quite easy to see how they will slide into these men's rights movements and try to make to revolt against this, because they see it as an inherent attack on the biological mechanisms which, you know, they are in place. They believe that's the way it is. You cannot change anything about it. So it makes sense then that they would protest this through men's rights movement. And to talk quickly about an extreme example of a men's rights activist. Maybe you remember it from when the presentation was originally done. There's this famous person here. His name is Roy den Hollander. He was kind of the extreme example of a men's rights activist, and I'll share a little bit about him now. He was a lawyer who constantly brought lawsuits toward those who he thought were discriminating against men. So he was in war, you could say. He sued clubs, filed lawsuits against clubs, nightclubs, who got men to pay for the entrance fee, but, you know, women on certain nights and occasions, they were able to get in free. They got free alcoholic drinks while the men had to pay. So, you know, the women went in free so that, you know, they would attract a lot of males hoping to find a woman in the club. He also sued Columbia University one time because they had a women's program or a women's gender studies program, but they didn't have the same for men. So he he actually challenged Columbia University, and in his lawsuit, he said that they did not separate church and state because when they were supporting feminism, they were supporting a religion. That's what 𝗿𝗏𝗴𝗃 believed and said in his lawsuit. So he was an atheist and repeated the concept that feminism is a religion. It's a belief system, he said, that advocates an accident of nature, which he said, you know, the fact that you're born a girl is just an accident of nature. And it's a belief system that advocates an accident of nature makes females superior to men in all matters under the sun. That was how he viewed it. And then he said also, the only problem with a life lived too long under feminazi rule is that a man ends up with so many enemies, he can't even keep score with all of them. So when he was given a terminal cancer diagnosis, what he did was he took a gun, he went to the house of a woman judge, and when the door opened, he just fired away. He killed her son, he shot her husband, although her husband survived, and then he fled before he found her. And shortly before that, he'd also shot another men's rights lawyer who he considered to be a rival of his. And then he took his life with the same gun that he shot all of these people with. So he couldn't just, you know, pass away with cancer or otherwise. He was determined to strike back even at the very end. Finishing with, I want to finish 𝗿𝗏𝗴𝗃𝗃 with a quote of his. Why do men have to relinquish their strength that evolution intrinsically through biology gave them, physical strength, while women, females, can really ruthlessly use the intrinsic strength that evolution gave them? I think that quote says a lot about his belief. But again, we see this intrinsic strength, intrinsic weakness, social Darwinistic thinking coming up again. So we're near the end now. Just want to finish off with a few quotes and pointers about 𝗿𝗏𝗴𝗃𝗃 as a case in point. The media had known about Roy for many years, but it was like he was just kind of a joke for them. And there's an article from The Atlantic that takes them to task on that point. Because if we think about it, again, as I said with the presidents, and you know, if Daniel Dennett would have used the same reasoning about biology to justify why all but one president has been black, then the same here. I mean, if this was a racial issue, no one would have taken him as a joke when you understood how this man thought and his ideas. So on racial issues, someone that dangerous would really not have been treated as much as a joke as Roy he was, because he did not try to make his hatred of women very well hidden. So just to read the very end of the Atlantic article, I have redacted it, and I couldn't share it because I didn't have access, so I just transcribed what says read verbatim. Quoting, because he was featured on The Daily Show in the 𝗂𝗏𝗴𝗃𝗃 report by 𝗂𝗏𝗃, and he, 𝗿𝗏𝗴𝗃𝗃, in his personal website put a link to his interview by the 𝗂𝗏𝗃 report, and next to the link, then 𝗂𝗏𝗃𝗃 included a note, if you can make them laugh at you, they won't expect something serious. He knew how dangerous he was. He knew that the media, the 𝗂𝗏𝗃 report, the Daily Show, MSNBC, CNN, Fox, that none of them really took him seriously because they thought it was funny. So they didn't like him, these news media outlets, but they thought it was funny. And there was that failure to see the seriousness of the problem. So 𝗿𝗏𝗴𝗃𝗃, he's an extreme example. But we went to him and highlighted him for a few reasons. So the first of all is this failure of the media for decades to see the danger in this trinity, men's rights, atheism and libertarianism. We haven't dug deep down to see, if he had this libertarianist thinking. It's more likely than not that he had, but he was a men's rights and a very strong men's rights activist, and he clearly was also a proponent of atheism. So probably more likely than not, I would also assume that he was also a libertarian, but I cannot confirm that. So that was the first reason that we went to him, to see this failure of the media, to see the danger in this trinity. And number two, particularly new atheism and the men's rights movements. We want to see that as well, to show evidence of someone referring to feminism as a religion, and again hinting at the reasons why they see feminism as a religion, why they link it to religion, and again that atheistic Darwinist belief of intrinsic strengths and weaknesses, and how that those gendered concepts support the men's rights movement, and that supports their misogyny. So it's important to see this link between misogyny and new atheism, stemming all the way back to these intrinsic strengths and weaknesses. Daniel Dennett saying the first explanation for why women they didn't have executive religious positions was biology. It's they're just not suited for it. Yeah, it's just important to see this link between misogyny and the new atheism and new atheism, and how it's connected. So I hope we can see it better now. And that was actually the end of the presentation. So let me finish with a word of prayer, and then we can discuss. Dear God in heaven, we're so grateful that over these last few years, you've steadily and progressively opened our eyes to actually really see what's going on in the world, that you've helped to broaden our perspective, and to not just look at Protestantism as the major problem for us here at the end of the world, apostate Protestantism, but that we can now see, for instance, how this trinity of men's rights activism, atheism, and libertarianism is in many ways the real threat, or at least a very, very big part of the threat against feminism and women's rights. I thank you that we're able to now see these issues for what they are, that we're able to understand them, and Lord, I pray that you'll help us to grapple with these things, because it's not always easy to see the connection between the different aspects of, let's just say, atheism or men's rights activism. But when you see it, it becomes really clear how it's connected. And as we try to see in this study, we don't just want to see the misogyny and the sexism. We want to understand the underlying reasons as to why these four horsemen and all that they represent, they act in this way, how they justify it, and how for them it's natural, and it's even supposed to be this way. It's not something that can be helped. Lord, you know that we've also had this thinking for many years before you opened our eyes, and we're just grateful that you helped us escape it, and we want to ask that you will help us to continue to escape it, because I'm sure that there are many areas in our lives where we're not aware of it, where we still have traces of it, or where we just don't see it the way that we should see it. We're blinded by our biases or many other things. So please give us this eye self, that we may see the sexism. We may look into ourselves and dig deep into ourselves, and see, maybe we have some beliefs, maybe we have some wrong ideas that actually hurts ourselves, but especially also the women in our lives and in our interactions. So help us to root it out. We know it's a long process and we have much to learn and even more to unlearn. Please be with us. Help us to help each other in this work, in this educational work, which has basically just only begun now, and we have a long way to go. But yeah, we want to thank you for the way that you led us so far. Please keep leading us and be with us during the rest of the Sabbath day. I pray this and thank you for being able to present in Jesus' name. Amen.